So imagine that you're a business analyst who is working on a project and you find out that the management of your company is going to be replacing the project manager that's been working on your project with a Scrum Master. Now, if you don't have a lot of experience working in those types of projects, then you might not necessarily understand the full impact of that change. And so in this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through what the difference is between having a project manager versus having a Scrum Master, some of the challenges that you as a business analyst or even as a developer or a QA person can expect to see from having that type of a change on your project. And then we can talk a little bit about some of the things that you can do to address those. Now, before I dive into that, if you haven't already done so, I'm going to recommend that you go back and you watch the first instance of the series that we have around what Agile is and what happens when Agile goes wrong in certain situations. Because in that first one, we addressed another very important topic that has to do with change requests in Agile environments and how you as a business analyst can address those. All right. So the main issue that we're going to be talking about here is the issue of the accountability gap. And what tends to happen in many organizations is that the management of the organization typically gets sold on the concept of Agile. And what happens is that without really understanding the full impact of making that shift from a traditional model into an Agile model, the management team will just ask for that to happen. And in the process of doing that, typically what they'll do is they'll either bring in like an Agile coach or a Scrum Master that is going to be taking the place of the project manager. And that process itself, them making that switch, is what leads to a major accountability gap in major projects. If your management isn't equipped to deal with that factor, if it's a pitfall that they don't even understand or see as part of that change from traditional to Agile, it's going to create a lot of problems for you as a business analyst, all right? So before we even get into that, really what I want to focus on is the fact that there is a large push from the Agile industry. So there's a lot of Agile consultants out there and a lot of Agile trainers that are trying to convince management of larger enterprise level organizations that they should be going in and doing Agile instead of their traditional projects. The management of those organizations, if they have good management, they understand what the pitfalls are, they typically will do a hybrid version of Agile instead of trying to go pure Agile. But in many instances, what tends to happen is that the management believes that they are a good fit for Agile, they try to do it, and then they have to kind of scale back their agileness and only adopt certain parts of the Agile development philosophy into their organizations. And so it's an unfortunate fact that there are many Agile concepts that can be a good fit for certain types of organizations. If your organization is not a good fit and your management tries to go Agile, there's going to be a lot of friction that you as a project team are going to experience because of the fact that your management believes you should be operating Agile, but they don't understand that your organization is not a good fit for Agile, right? And so what tends to happen is that there are many Agile concepts that tend to break down very quickly when they try to implement them in certain enterprise environments. And the concept that applies for us today is the concept of a self-organizing team, or in the latest version of the Scrum Guide, they call it the self-managing team. And essentially in the Agile world, what this essentially is trying to say is that project teams require a little bit of guidance and support from a Scrum Master to be able to figure out how to become self-organizing and self-managing so that at a certain level of maturity, or once they've gained a certain amount of momentum, what the Agile coach or the Scrum Master can do is that they can completely leave that situation and have the self-organizing or self-managing team continuing to operate at that same momentum that they have been kind of revved up to, right? That's the whole concept around the self-organizing or the self-managing team in Agile. And again, it may be a very, very good fit for software companies, right? Because if you really think about what a software company is, software companies' core competency is to actually build software. So being able to self-organize or self-manage as an organization is really built into the DNA of those types of organizations, because those types of organizations, all they do is build software, right? And so those are really the types of organizations where this concept of self-organizing or self-managing teams can really work well. But in most traditional enterprise level organizations, this concept itself is unrealistic and it's overly optimistic, because what they're essentially doing is that they are trying to change the project team structure from one that is a good fit for the enterprise, tends to be a much more command and control type of a circumstance in these types of traditional projects. That is a very good fit for many enterprises that exist out there. This type of a structure would be probably a little bit too restrictive for a software company that needs to produce things very quickly and deliver and ship things very quickly. But this type of a structure for many traditional organizations is a much closer fit than Agile. Now, in a traditional situation like this, you would have a project manager that is typically accountable to the management of the organization, which is typically part of a group in a project called the steering committee or the oversight or governance committee of the project. The project manager is the person that is accountable for all three major aspects of a project, right? So, and those three aspects being really to make sure that the project team can deliver the scope to a certain level of quality that's been agreed to, for the amount of money that has been budgeted to the project, with the timelines that have been agreed to and estimated out and agreed to between all of the different stakeholders involved. That is what the project manager is typically accountable to the steering committee for. And the project manager typically has a lot of leeway in the way that they run that project to make sure that they are hitting their targets when it comes to those three different aspects of a project, right? This is how traditional project management works. And you can see from this picture that really everybody that you have that is involved in the project, from your customers, your subject matter experts, your end users, to the business analysts, to the set of developers and the QA folks. And there's a lot of other people that are involved, like DevOps and infrastructure and different folks from different areas of the organizations that typically get involved. There are, if you are engaging external vendors, it is typically the project manager's responsibility to make sure that they're managing those vendors in a way that is in line with the way that the project is executing, right? You can see from this that in this situation, all lines basically lead to the project manager, because the accountability for making sure that they hit the deadlines, stay within the budget, and deliver the scope that's been agreed to up to a certain level of quality all rests with the project manager, right? And in a traditional organization, on traditional projects, this is the way that things are structured. Now imagine that you're on a project like this and you find out that Brody is no longer going to be with the organization, and what they're going to do is that they are going to bring in Jake, the Scrum Master, now to take over, and now your project is going to be switching from a traditional, partially waterfall methodology over to an Agile methodology, right? If Jake comes in, you are automatically going to start to realize that Jake, the Scrum Master, is going to be operating very, very differently than the way that Brody did as the project manager, right? Where the project manager here was really in control of everything. They basically were the person that you would go to escalate an issue that you're having, either with the stakeholder side or with the development team or with the vendors or anybody else. That person no longer exists in the organization, right? Because when you start to work with a Scrum Master, the philosophy of Agile says that Scrum Masters really aren't the type of person who are the command and control type of a person, right? They don't fulfill that role at all. And what's even more important is that the Scrum Master isn't accountable for the scope, the schedule, and the cost of the project. What the Scrum Master is really accountable for is to make sure that the efficiency of the team is at a certain level. And that in itself, what it tends to do to project teams is that it tends to create a massive gap in the accountability that had existed in that situation, because this person here, Jake, is not actually going to be fulfilling the role that Brody was fulfilling in that organization. And so if your project is midstream and they try to make the switch into Agile, you can see that there's going to be a massive amount of instability and chaos that it creates. And if it's not managed in a good way, what it tends to do for the business analysts and even for the development and the rest of the teams is that that instability creates a lot of friction. It actually adds quite a bit to the schedule and the cost of a project, because the management of the organization has been sold on this idea that we should have a Scrum Master, that we should have somebody who is a product owner or a product manager, and they take Brody out of the mix, and they don't fully fill this gap in the way that they should be filling them, right? So if your organization attempts to do this, the hope in that situation is that eventually what is going to happen is that the person who was the Scrum Master and who was really trying to lead by example and trying to coach the team into making sure that they become a self-managing or self-organizing team, that person, even though they might retain the title of a Scrum Master, if the project has any hope of actually delivering to some of the commitments that it's made, this person you'll find is eventually going to slowly start to migrate into filling that gap, even though Agile wasn't and doesn't recommend that the Scrum Master hold that position, right? Again, in the Agile world, what the recommendation is for the Scrum Master really to be completely outside of this area here, and for the Scrum Master really to be setting examples and training the team and making sure that they are servants or servant leaders, as they call them in the Agile world, and to make sure that all of these different stakeholders who have competing priorities, different skill sets, different aptitudes, that's somehow supposed to magically all work together in the Agile world. And reality of the fact is that it just simply doesn't. And so if you're an analyst and you're going to be in a situation like this, you just have to be aware of the fact that if your organization is switching into an Agile mindset midstream, or even if they're trying to do it at the very beginning, you'll find very quickly that if they don't start to fill in this accountability gap that the project manager leaves behind, things start to get very chaotic inside your projects, and there's a lot of friction. Now, as an analyst, you have a couple of different options in that situation, right? If you're entering into that situation, you can, if you have the will to do it, you can actually start to take a bit of a leadership role and see if you can start to fill in some of this accountability gap. But if you're choosing to do that, you have to make sure that you understand that you as an analyst are going to need more analysis horsepower here to make sure that the work is being fed to the development and to the QA teams in a way that's going to help you meet the schedule. But in many situations, if you're not the person who wants to fill this accountability gap, you are going to have to start building much tighter relationships with typically with the architect and with your customers, and sometimes they may even expect you to work with the senior management in that situation to make sure that management understands exactly where things are at, right? And it's not an ideal situation, but it's a circumstance that you can find yourself in as an analyst. You just need to be aware that the concept of Scrum, if it gets adopted in your organization in a way that is not a good fit, it can potentially put a lot of problems for you and the rest of the project team. Now, in the latest member session that we had, we talked a little bit more about some of the things that an analyst can do in these types of circumstances to try to figure out whether they are capable of taking on this accountability or not. So if you're not signed up as a member yet, I'm going to recommend that you definitely do sign up and go and check out that video. It's about an hour where we basically talked about some of the major issues that business analysts experience, especially when it comes to Agile projects, dealing with product owners, dealing with Scrum Masters. And in that video, we talked, actually the idea for this video came out of one of the community members that we had that kind of brought this issue up. So if you're not already a member, please go ahead and sign up and understand that this is a challenge that you are likely to experience, and you should be prepared to be able to at least understand what's happening in that environment if the Scrum Master replaces the project manager. All right, so I'll leave this video here and I'll see you on the next one.